Right, well, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to come along and talk tonight. This is a bit of a first for me, talking from a pulpit. People do say I get a bit preachy from time to time, but I'll try and avoid that tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think you're the 103rd group to be established in the People's Assembly around the country after just a few months of building the People's Assembly from last June when 4,000 people met in London to set it up. So what is it that's led to this fastest growing political movement in Britain? I wear a few hats. I'm the trade union officer of the People's Charter. I'm the chair of the Communist Party. I'm an ex-president of the NUT. All of those, I'm delighted to say, are organisations which lent their names to a letter to go to the Guardian to call for a People's Assembly because we felt, along the 50-odd signatories to it, felt that working people, ordinary people in Britain, were being left unrepresented in the political arena, were being left unrepresented in the economic arena, and were being encouraged to think by just about everyone that there's nothing you can do to change the situation that we're in at the moment. And we wrote the letter and we called the Assembly, but it took off in a way that none of those organisations I've talked about before have taken off in the past. Suddenly it was an idea that was of its time. The People's Charter, for example, was established in 2000, just at the end of 2007, right at the beginning of the crisis. You remember that they started calling a credit crunch at the beginning, as though it was some kind of mysterious breakfast cereal, but certainly nothing to worry about, a bit of a blip. And then it became apparent to people this was a kind of meltdown. There was something that was happening to the system that the government promoted, that the captains of industry promoted, something that was happening which they were now no longer in control of. And therefore, what needed to be proposed was an entirely alternative set of proposals, economic, social and political policies that could actually sustain the world, sustain the planet, sustain ordinary human beings. So that's where the People's Charter came from, and it got 19 unions signed up to it. It was passed by the Trades Union Congress, the Women's TUC, Scottish Welsh. Everybody passed the People's Charter, but not many people did much about it because it just sat there on the shelf. It was a set of policies. But now things are becoming acute. Now people are beginning to realise that these set of policies, if that's what they are, austerity policies, are impacting on people right across the nation, impacting on people disproportionately so that the most vulnerable are hit the hardest. But as the most vulnerable are hit, so the next set of the population is hit. Rather like peeling an onion, until we all find ourselves, not in the cataclysmic austerity in Greece or Portugal at the moment, but a much more insidious, slow system of permanent austerity that will erode, as a previous speaker said, everything that we've built up since 1940. I just started making a list sitting down there. I was going to ask you, is there anyone in the room who does not want to oppose austerity, who's just come out of interest tonight to hear the alternatives? Because there's a strength in our assemblies that we bring together people who are opposed to austerity, but the difficulty is that most people in the country are not in favour of austerity, but believe it is necessary. They believe that somehow we all have to tighten our belts still in order to achieve a stabilised economy. We have a huge job to do to go to those people and explain that austerity itself is not in any way necessary, but is a deliberate policy designed to enrich the rich at the expense of the poor. That's what austerity does. You've heard figures given to you. We know the worldwide figures, absolutely incredible figures about the disparity in wealth worldwide. 85 people. You get 85 people onto a London double-decker bus, where I originally came from London. 85 people in the world own the same amount of wealth as 3.5 billion people, half the world's population. It's hardly believable, is it? But it's a fact. 85 people own the same as 3.5 billion people. The National Office of Statistics says that the top 10% of the population have access to cash, to spending money, a kind of liquid capital. The top 10% on average of just over £1 million, £1.1 million per household of the top 10% of the population. The bottom 50% have access to £4,000. If you put £4,000 in £20 notes in a pile, they come up to the top of a cigarette packet. If you put the cash that the top 10% of the population have access to in a pile of £20 notes, it comes up to the top of 2 double-decker buses. And every month, the widening of the poverty gap means that someone takes a £20 note off the little pile that comes up to the top of a cigarette packet and puts it on the pile that comes to the top of the double-decker buses. That's how fast the poverty gap is widening and how extreme it is. So I started writing a list. What is it that's brought us all here from disparate backgrounds? People of faith, left-wing political parties, conservationist groups, people who want to protest against injustice. What is it that makes us angry? And I'm afraid, though I read on one of the pillars of the church that anger is not a great thing, I think there's a bit of room for anger. I made a list. I ran out of space because my paper wasn't long enough. What does get us angry? With those huge disparities, the unemployment figures and the constant massaging of unemployment figures, which show unemployment falling at the same time as part-time working and self-employment rises. In other words, more people out of work who are desperate to earn some money are no longer eligible for unemployment benefit, and therefore the government calls it a reduction in unemployment. Or is it the arrogance of the energy companies saying, if you dare have an inquiry into our prices, we may not invest in British energy anymore, so leave us alone? The news that was out today. Is it the bankers, £90 billion worth of profit and bonuses that they earned last year, or they paid themselves last year, that they accumulated last year, despite having brought the world to the brink of collapse? Is it the fact that corporation tax has been cut and therefore the big businesses can legitimately pay less in corporation tax to the exact same amount it would cost to make every National Health Service prescription free in Britain? The equivalence of that cost hits you in the face. Is it the fact that you can't go on strike without a ballot, a cooling off period and all kinds of legal hurdles to leave, but you can close a factory and take it abroad in search of cheap labour, in search of higher profits, without the slightest bit of any argument, without any legal impediment, profitable companies where workers have worked and the workers are thrown out of business? Or is it the importation of young people from economies that have been destroyed abroad? 500,000 young Poles leaving the country in a year. That's not free movement of labour. They didn't all decide to up and do it just for the sake of it. They went because their economy had been destroyed by the crisis, by the collapse of their economic system, and then they were imported, and under European Union legislation, they can be paid at the rate that they would be paid in Poland rather than the rate here. That's free movement of labour. And there's a new agreement now between the European Union and India that Indian workers coming to Britain can be legitimately paid below the rate, below the minimum wage, as long as they would have been paid that in India. These things come at us every day. The facts and figures come at us every day. Is it the tax avoidance? Is it the fact that every town now has food banks, payday loan sharks? The thing that infuriates me is the way that payday loan sharks are presented in the media as somehow a benevolent kind of family outfit just to see you through to the end of the week and everything will be fine then, obviously. Well, they aren't, are they? They're pariahs. They are vultures. And they live off people's poverty. But all of these things make us angry. But we think, all the people in this room and all the people in the People's Assembly, that there is something we can do about it. But I guarantee you this, when you talk to your friends, family, colleagues at work, anyone you know about the People's Assembly, you will get to the point where they say, yeah, but there's nothing you can do about it, is there? We can't do anything about it. What can I do? And the fact is, what we have to demonstrate now is that this movement is rather different. This campaign is rather a different campaign. We start as a campaign. Campaigns are top-down, really, organisations, aren't they? Of people with a website, people with leaflets, people with pamphlets, people with petitions who stop you in the street when you're too busy and ask you to sign the petition, and people say, no, mate, I'm all right, thanks, all that. That's a campaign where you... But what we're trying to build in the People's Assembly is a mass movement of ordinary people. People who don't consume the campaign, people who don't come along and say, what's the People's Assembly doing? I might join in. The People's Assembly is going to be about every single person in this room being an activist and building the movement. finding 2, 3 people in your street who will form a street committee of the People's Assembly and a neighbourhood council of the People's Assembly, till we get to the stage where we're involving hundreds of thousands of people across the country in regular activity. That's the ambition. Some people think it ridiculous, but that is the ambition of the People's Assembly, to reassert ordinary people's right to make things happen. Not to hope that someone else will make it happen for us, not to hope, current company accepted of course, that anybody who enters Parliament will make it happen for us. They may wish to make it happen, but what happens? Where does this austerity come from? This is another great thing about the People's Assembly. We can have slight differences of emphasis, differences of view, and bring all those people together on a common programme of opposition. You see, I think austerity is working. It's not about the deficit, and never was about the deficit. The deficit could have been paid off, as comrades have said, by targeting the tax bill, by closing the tax havens, by bringing into public ownership the utilities. It could easily have been tackled. 120 billion. The deficit is 95 billion. There is 120 billion of evaded tax. Why has the government not made that the target? Because they represent the tax evaders. That's why. That's their people. That's why they do nothing about it. But they had a crisis. And it was until we understand the nature of that crisis, we can't really tackle the policies that have risen as a result. They could not make money from industrial investment. This is what happened in the early 2000s. The rate of profit on investing in industry was going right down. Why? Because China, Brazil, India, South Africa are pumping new industrial products into the world. And there is a huge amount of industrial availability of things produced by industry. And the profit levels have dropped. There's no doubt about it. If we look at them, they drop. So what do? They pumped all the money, the very wealthiest people of the world, pumped their money into the financial markets. And that reached a point, as we know, where they were creating debt that could never be repaid. And at that point, the thing suddenly imploded. What are they meant to do now in order to re-establish their way of maintaining their fabulous wealth and their position at the top of society in terms of income and wealth? What they have to do is reduce people's living standards so that profits go up. This is what the government means by economic recovery. And it has happened. You can judge economic recovery 2 ways. One is whether the gross domestic product increases because of increased output. That's only one way. The other way is that you look at the average income. And if that increases, you can say there's an economic recovery. The average income in Britain has increased. If you include the people at the top of society, the top 1,000 people who own £414 billion between them. It's a record. We've never had so many billionaires, and we've never had so many multi-billionaires. So if you include them, there has been an average increase in income. That is the economic recovery. Greater profits from industry as a result of the reduction in wages and pensions of ordinary people. And how do you ensure the reduction in wages and pensions? By attacking the trade union movement and prevent them from fighting back. So all of these policies start to come together. You can see how that's important. Yes, but where, if you had £100,000, £1 million, where would you invest it? In industry, where there's a very low rate of profit at the moment? In finance, which has collapsed? No. In the new continent that's called public services. The privatisation of all public services for profit is where they are going to put their money. They have to do it. It is not just a matter, I accept the point that made about the ideological perspective of this, of people who think that this is the right way of doing it, but in order for capital to be invested, large amounts of money to be invested and get a good return, they have to find a new place to invest. And that's going to be in schools, hospitals, old people's homes, youth centres, where they will make a profit. And where they won't make a profit, well, if you want a mobile library, go and buy a van. That's what they'll tell you. Run it for yourself. There's plenty of second-hand bookshops. Go and buy the books, buy yourself a van, get out and lend the books. The big society. And this is where we're headed in just a very short period of time. We need our political parties to look at this and say, is there an alternative? Because at the moment, again, present company accepted, amongst the leading political parties, there is not an opposition being put forward to this philosophy. Privatisation, cuts to pay and pensions will continue, we're told, by the Leader of the Opposition and by the Chancellor, the Shadow Chancellor. So where are we? We're in a position where these things are occurring, and they're not just occurring because we've got bad politicians, but because the people with real power at the top of society demand the right to have high levels of profit on their investment. This is what the People's Charter tried to do. It tried to propose a different set of politics, of economics, of social policies, and that we could build the country on. But of course, they all mean, in the words of the 1973 Labour manifesto, an irreversible shift of wealth and power in favour of working people. That was the promise that was made in the Labour manifesto. We need to see that again in manifestos, because that is the only way of tackling what we're facing at the moment. When we had the initial big foundation conference in London, Francis O'Grady from the TUC said it's a class war. It was a bit shocking to a lot of people. But when you look at the facts and figures that you've been given by other people, the fact that that top 10% of the population, both in the world and domestically, are increasing their wealth and power and have consistently all the way through the recession, while those of us in the 50% of the population who own 1% of the wealth between us have got a smaller share and a decline, there is not really much doubt that the motivation for this isn't just a political ideology, it is an economic system that demands that people at the bottom should make do and mend while the people at the top increase their percentage, increase their income. So we need to become not just a campaign but a movement, and I think that means that we need to go out and talk with somebody, as one of my colleagues here said, to tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people around the country. We have to point out that privatisation results not just in higher prices, but in 1,600 Royal Mail workers, for example, who were promised it wouldn't affect them in any way at all, now being sacked. With my own trade, education, where you see the free schools and academies laying the ground for what has been a privatised education service elsewhere where they've been introduced. And how will they make profit? The government's introduced legislation to say you don't need qualified teachers in those schools. They can be taught by teaching assistants, half the price. That's ideal, isn't it? And that teachers are working 60 hours a week. Well, they need to work that quantity of time. They need to have 30 in the class because it has to be a profitable industry. So we're just at the beginning. We've had about 15%, 18% of the cuts, though of course they keep announcing new ones on top. But we're just at the beginning of the process of privatisation and immiseration of the ordinary people of this country. If it's too much to swallow, if you think it's just an eccentric kind of notion, think back to the 1930s. Have we all fundamentally changed? Are we different? And yet people were left then. My own mother left school at 14, and she'd done better than most. She could stay on longer, but in the end the family couldn't afford. If they got sick, they had to decide whether or not to pay for a doctor. Now, try and find a national health dentist. Do you pay to have your teeth done? Well, next year you'll pay to have your broken bones done. This is coming to Britain. It is a process of the immiseration of ordinary people, the undermining of life, in order to move a fundamental and irreversible shift of wealth and power in favour of the wealthy and powerful. That's what we're seeing happening. So we're trying to do something about it. We're trying to convince people we can do something about it. I tell people, I've tried to understand economics. I'm 62 now, for a long time. I took economics at school, and my teacher, my first economic teacher when I was just started doing my O-level, said, it was a Friday afternoon, and he said, well, I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted this week. I've had enough. And we've got another lesson on Monday, so why don't we just take the afternoon off? This is from the teacher. And we thought, is that possible? And he said, well, we won't get anywhere this afternoon. Everyone's tired. So pack up your things, go quietly when you leave the school, but just make your way out. And he said, oh, by the way, we'd better make sure everyone's in agreement. We'll have a vote on it. Everybody is in favour of taking the afternoon off. So we all put our hands up. He put his hand up. He said, that's unanimous. Excellent. Right. Off you go. Be quiet as you leave. And we started packing up, and he said, oh, just one thing, of course, I'm paid to work here, obviously, and I'm going to lose half a day's pay. So how much have you got on you? And I thought it was a bit odd. He said, come on, just show me. So we all got our pennies and shillings and sixpences and things out, put them on the desk, and he went round and he was counting up like this. And he said, well, that's ridiculous. That's nowhere near enough. That's nowhere near what I earn. No, that's no good, but I'll just have to get on. And we said, well, that's not fair. We just had a vote. You called a vote, and we all had a vote. He said, oh, I see what you're doing. And he said, you're confusing democracy, which is where the people decide what will happen, with economic democracy, which is where the people with the money decide what will happen. Now, that was the greatest lesson to me in terms of economics. That is the way the world is. This is not just a policy of a government. It's a policy of that very rich capitalist millionaire class worldwide, that they are going to reverse those gains, the social wage, the job security, those kinds of things that we've all grown up with. I've grown up in a gifted generation, born just at the right time. I've never been called on to fight in a world war. I've never faced that kind of poverty that people in those other... But the other important thing about me, if the others are important, is today I became the grandfather of my 6th grandchild. And he is going to grow up in a completely different world unless we stop it. So the point of the People's Assembly is not to protest, it's not to campaign, it's to win. And that means finding ways of motivating people in the trade union movement in communities to fight back and to prevent this government from going on. It means civil disobedience, it means widespread industrial action, it means inconvenience for us, it will mean commitment and determination. But if we really believe that this government is attacking ordinary working people and will have permanent austerity, we can do nothing other than take up that challenge. So when we look around this church and meeting halls and community centres, we need to see People's Assembly stuff everywhere. We need to see it in windows. We need to talk to people. It needs to be displayed publicly. But we've got to raise the issue. How dare they destroy the future of our children and our grandchildren when they brought the world to the brink of ruin? How dare they use their own inadequacies of their system and cruelties of the way that they impose it as an excuse for attacking us further? And we've got to say, if, as Claire says, if there is no other way of representing ourselves, we need to represent ourselves. That means that this movement is not going to be easy to control. There'll be all different types of views in it. There'll be environmentalist views. There'll be views of people who think we can do it by reform. There are people who are overthrowing the whole system. There'll be people of all different kinds involved in this movement, and our job is to make sure it's cemented together, that we work together, that we talk things through, that we, as Bob Crow said when he came up to Derby, when they sacked 1,400 workers from the railway industry, he came up and he said, if you don't fight, you will not win. If you do fight, you may not win. You certainly may not win immediately, but by fighting, you will unite and ignite the people, and then we'll be unstoppable. And that's the task of the People's Assembly. Thank you very much for inviting me.